An asphalt parking lot outside a low-rise glass office block off Highway 401 in Mississauga. Silver sedans idling under light standards, concrete median strips holding planted maple saplings, and a storm pond behind a chain-link fence collecting runoff from 8 lanes of traffic. To anyone stepping out of the lobby, this is simply the outer fringe of Toronto. A suburban workplace, a quiet municipality, an address on a parcel map. That impression is entirely wrong. What looks like a single, continuous metropolis flowing outwards from Lake Ontario is actually a patchwork of competing jurisdictions covering over 10,000 square kilometers, where more than 100 individual municipal councils, regional governments, and local planning boards operate without a unified strategy. The remarkable part is not that this massive urban fabric is fractured, but that for decades, millions of residents and corporate planners navigated it daily without noticing that the central coordinating authority they assumed was directing this expansion simply does not exist. How did a geographic area containing nearly 8 million people transform into one of North America's most powerful economic engines while functioning as dozens of independent, self-interested fiefdoms? To understand how the Greater Golden Horseshoe became a decentralized economic machine, you have to look at what people originally assumed about the region. For over a century, the standard view among geographers and urban planners was that Southern Ontario operated on a simple hub-and-spoke model. Toronto sat at the center as the financial engine, Bay Street directed the capital, and the surrounding agricultural townships were destined to serve as quiet bedroom communities, supplying labor and receiving municipal services in an orderly, radial progression. That assumption was reasonable in its time. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, transportation routes dictated a strict hierarchy. Railways converged on Union Station. Lake vessels unloaded coal and timber along the Toronto waterfront. The surrounding countryside was organized neatly by the Crown surveys into concession roads and lot lines, dedicated almost entirely to farming. When manufacturing expanded, it followed the heavy rail corridors into established hubs. Toronto handled stock trading, insurance, and dry goods wholesaling, while 60 kilometers to the west, Hamilton established itself as the country's undisputed steel and heavy industrial capital. Each city had a clearly defined role, a distinct identity, and an obvious boundaries map bounded by rural townships. The first crack in that orderly assumption appeared not in the historic downtown cores, but along the right-of-way of Canada's first dual-carriageway divided highway. When the Queen Elizabeth Way and later Highway 401 cut across the farmland of Peel, Halton, and York, they bypassed the old urban centers entirely. Suddenly, proximity to a downtown rail terminal mattered less than access to a highway interchange. Land that had been valued solely for wheat yield or apple orchards became infinitely more valuable as flat, cheap acreage for light industrial parks and low-density corporate campuses. Instead of growing outward as a single, coordinated organism directed by a central metropolis, the region fractured into an intense zero-sum competition. Municipalities like Mississauga, Brampton, Vaughan, and Markham realized they did not need to be suburban appendages to Toronto. By creating their own economic development departments, offering streamlined zoning, and establishing aggressive tax structures, these former agricultural townships began competing directly against the historic core and against each other for corporate headquarters, distribution hubs, and commercial assessment. The result was an economic landscape where power and employment were thoroughly decentralized. A global technology firm or a national bank moving thousands of workers no longer looks for space downtown. It sets up a massive campus in Meadowvale, along the Highway 404 corridor in Markham, or near the airport in Peel region. Each suburban municipality acts as an independent development firm, spending millions in public infrastructure to lure investment away from the exit ramp next door. This fragmented competition created immense wealth, but it also built a region without a single blueprint. While the highway asphalt and suburban housing developments seamlessly connect one town to the next, the underlying administrative reality remains wildly divided. Beneath the shared asphalt lies a complex lattice of regional municipalities, independent single-tier cities, upper-tier counties, and conservation authorities, each guarding its tax base, its water allocations, and its local planning autonomy with fierce independence. To trace how this regional fragmentation was carved into the land, you have to look back to the precise geological and survey conditions that governed southern Ontario long before the first highway was paved. For millennia, the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples followed the natural contours of the watershed, the rivers flowing into Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and Georgian Bay. Traveling by canoe and establishing trails along ridge lines like the Niagara Escarpment, Indigenous communities understood the terrain through hydrological basins and seasonal resource networks. When Crown surveyors under Deputy Surveyor General John Collins began marking out township boundaries in the late 18th century, they ignored these natural systems entirely. Working with iron chains and magnetic compasses, surveyors laid down rigid rectilinear grids across hundreds of thousands of hectares of forest. The initial survey method, the single front system, divided the land into narrow 200-acre lots along concession lines. Because magnetic declination was poorly understood and dense forest obstructed long sight lines, these survey grids routinely drifted out of alignment. Townships surveyed 5 years apart by different crews met at awkward angles, leaving wedge-shaped gaps and overlapping gores across the province. These early survey boundaries did not disappear. They froze into place. The concession lines became local road grids, and the arbitrary township squares became self-governing administrative units under the Baldwin Act of 1849. Overnight, hundreds of rural townships across Canada West were given independent municipal authority to levy property taxes, maintain local roads, and manage public land. The law created a deeply entrenched tradition of local autonomy. Every small agricultural township held legal title to its own development decisions, completely insulated from its neighbors. Then came the physical transformation of the earth itself. 20,000 years ago, the Laurentide ice sheet covered this entire basin under 2 kilometers of ice. As the ice sheet retreated, it deposited thick beds of glacial till, silt, and gravel, leaving behind a flat, highly fertile till plain bounded by glacial moraines, such as the Oak Ridges moraine to the north. These deep, unconsolidated glacial deposits made southern Ontario some of the most productive farmland in British North America, but they created a severe geological limitation that would define the modern metropolis: a near-total absence of accessible surface water in the interior. Unlike cities built along major rivers, the townships sitting 15 to 40 kilometers back from Lake Ontario had no large lakes or reliable rivers. Settlers relied on shallow, hand-dug wells tapping local water tables in the glacial drift. For over a century, this hydrogeological constraint kept the interior townships small and agrarian. A township could support a few thousand farming families, but it could never support a dense urban population or heavy industrial plants without running its aquifers dry. The triggering event that broke this geological limit occurred mid-century. The introduction of heavy engineering, high-pressure trunk water lines, and provincial highway networks suddenly decoupled urban development from local hydrogeology. Water piped directly from Lake Ontario could now be pumped tens of kilometers inland, across county lines, to land that had spent 2 centuries as pasture. At the exact moment technology removed the physical limit to growth, the old 1849 survey boundaries reasserted themselves. Agricultural townships that had contained 3,000 residents in 1950 suddenly found themselves sitting on thousands of hectares of flat, easily drained glacial till adjacent to multi-lane provincial highways. Because municipal law still granted them absolute local planning authority, these township councils could rezone thousands of hectares of prime agricultural land for commercial subdivisions in a single afternoon. Rather than merging into a coordinated regional framework, each municipality used its legal independence to capture as much industrial and commercial tax assessment as possible. The race for assessment was on. Peel, Halton, York, and Durham competed fiercely, using Lake Ontario water intakes to unlock massive inland developments that pushed the urban boundary further north each year. By the late 20th century, the Geological Survey of Canada and regional conservation authorities began documenting the environmental consequences of this uncoordinated expansion over the glacial till. Wetlands were cleared, headwater streams were channelized into concrete culverts, and the recharge areas of the Oak Ridges moraine faced severe pressure from continuous suburban paving. Yet despite these environmental warnings and multiple attempts by the provincial government to impose regional governance, the fundamental economic driver remained unchanged: municipal independence backed by competition for private investment. This brings us directly to the present day, where corporate titans exploit these ancient survey lines to pit one local council against another, creating economic shifts that dwarf the budgets of the municipalities involved. But how exactly does this intense municipal competition function when billions of dollars in corporate capital and infrastructure are on the line? The proof that this vast metropolis had fractured into independent, competing nodes did not come from an urban planning report or a political declaration. It was revealed through spatial analytics, aerial photogrammetry, and cadastral mapping compiled by cartographers at the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing and Natural Resources Canada. For decades, standard topographic maps showed southern Ontario as an orderly network of roads connecting defined towns. But starting in the late 1970s, researchers utilizing high-resolution orthophotography and airborne sensor arrays began layering tax assessment parcels, zoning classifications, and industrial water consumption data onto physical geographic maps. When cartographers overlaid these datasets, the true visual pattern of the region emerged for the first time. The classic monocentric map, a dominant urban core surrounded by concentric rings of residential suburbs, was entirely absent. Instead, multispectral satellite imagery and land use mapping revealed a polycentric mosaic. Pockets of high-density corporate offices, massive logistics facilities, and manufacturing plants were scattered across suburban interchanges 50 kilometers from Bay Street, directly adjacent to working farmland. By cross-referencing provincial cadastral survey records from the 1800s with modern GIS parcel databases, geographers identified the exact mechanism behind this scatter. The original survey township lines, drawn 2 centuries earlier, acted as rigid administrative boundaries. Inside each grid square, municipal economic development corporations were operating independently. The data revealed staggering disparities. In Peel region, the city of Mississauga aggressively developed over 280 square kilometers of farmland, capturing thousands of corporate headquarters and building a tax base capable of funding major public transit and cultural infrastructure without relying on Toronto. Meanwhile, just across the regional boundary line, adjacent municipalities were forced to pursue completely different tax capture strategies, zoning agricultural land for massive industrial logistics parks along Highway 401 and Highway 407. The definitive proof of this administrative fragmentation came from hydrogeological and infrastructure mapping conducted by the Water Resources Branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Geological Survey of Canada. When hydrologists mapped groundwater drawdown across the regional aquifers, they discovered that individual municipalities were drilling competing municipal well fields into the same buried glacial aquifers, drawing down regional water levels without cross-border coordination. Similarly, traffic flow analysis using telemetry sensors along provincial highway corridors demonstrated that over 60% of commuter trips were no longer inbound toward downtown Toronto. Instead, traffic was moving laterally, from suburban municipality to suburban municipality, along east-west highway networks like the 401 and 407. The region was functioning not as a single integrated city, but as a high-density archipelago of competing corporate and municipal districts tied together only by provincial highways and water trunk mains. To quantify the magnitude of this decentralized machine, researchers analyzed corporate property assessments and municipal incentive programs. In major suburban employment nodes like Meadowvale, Markham Centre, and the Highway 7 corridor, corporate capital investments had outstripped those of the traditional urban core. Suburbs were actively outbidding the central city for multi-million-dollar technology campuses and financial facilities by offering lower commercial tax rates and faster development approvals. The map had finally caught up with reality. Southern Ontario was not one expanding city, but a collection of distinct, self-interested entities locked in a perpetual struggle for assessment, infrastructure, and water. Yet as this sprawling polycentric network continues to expand across thousands of square kilometers, it faces severe physical and structural limits that cannot be solved by municipal incentives alone. limits that are now coming due across the entire landscape. The consequences of this competitive, decentralized growth engine are now written directly into the physical landscape, the regional economy, and the daily lives of the nearly 8 million people who inhabit this corridor. The most immediate limit the region faces is not land, but water. Farther out along the expansion corridor, in fast-growing exurban municipalities like Caledon, East Gwillimbury, and Outer Simcoe County, the agricultural till plain meets hard hydrogeological boundaries. In these fringe communities, median home prices surged past $850,000 as developers sold serviced lots before foundation footings were even poured. Yet behind the speculative housing boom lies an immovable geographic reality. These inland townships sit high above Lake Ontario and have no direct access to municipal lake water pipelines. To sustain this rapid expansion, municipalities have been forced to fund massive, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects. Regional municipalities across the Greater Golden Horseshoe are spending an estimated combined total of over $12 billion on water trunk mains, pumping stations, and wastewater treatment facility expansions, simply to keep pace with housing targets. In many cases, individual regional districts must construct pipeline corridors stretching over 40 kilometers to transport Lake Ontario water uphill across ancient glacial moraines to suburban housing tracts that would otherwise run dry. When financial conditions shift, when interest rates rise or regional housing markets cool, these over-leveraged development plans stall rapidly. In exurban communities across the Outer Ring, median home prices dropped by more than 15% in single calendar years, leaving developers holding graded dirt and municipal councils facing immense debt loads for trunk water lines built for populations that have not yet arrived. The physical landscape reflects this friction everywhere. Unlike traditional European or early North American cities bounded by greenbelts or clear topographical barriers, the edge of the Greater Golden Horseshoe stops and starts according to municipal tax incentives and parcel assembly. A 6-lane suburban boulevard flanked by glass-faced corporate offices and logistics warehouses suddenly dead ends into a cornfield, only to resume 2 kilometers later inside the neighboring municipal jurisdiction. Infrastructure integration has suffered the most severe consequences. Because transit governance was historically fractured among dozens of local transit agencies, including Metrolinx, local municipal bus systems, and regional transit authorities, building a single, seamless regional transit grid took decades to negotiate. Commuters crossing from one regional municipality to another routinely faced separate fare structures, mismatched bus schedules, and uncoordinated suburban rail terminals. The economic cost of this fragmentation is staggeringly high. Transport Canada and regional boards of trade estimate that highway congestion along the 400 series corridors, driven primarily by lateral, suburb-to-suburb commuting across municipal lines, costs the regional economy over $6 billion annually in lost productivity, excess fuel consumption, and supply chain delays. Furthermore, environmental monitoring by conservation authorities shows that impervious surface cover, pavement, rooftops, and parking lots now exceeds 30% in several sub-watersheds. This massive altered footprint accelerates stormwater runoff, worsens localized flooding during heavy precipitation events, and severely reduces the natural recharge rates of deep glacial aquifers. The region grows until it hits a physical or financial limit, and those limits are now appearing simultaneously across water supply, transit capacity, and debt loads. Yet, despite these mounting systemic pressures, the underlying administrative structure remains as fiercely divided as ever. So, where does a regional economy go when it can no longer expand outward without running out of water, road capacity, and municipal capital? When you peel back the layers of regional transit plans, municipal tax codes, and infrastructure investments, the ultimate trajectory of this fragmented region becomes remarkably clear. The Greater Golden Horseshoe does not possess a central steering wheel because its legal and physical foundation was expressly designed to function without one. What allowed this radical decentralization to remain invisible for so long was a simple cognitive habit. People conflated continuous asphalt with continuous governance. Because a car can drive continuously from Oshawa to Hamilton along Highway 401 and the QEW, without encountering a toll booth or a border checkpoint, commuters assumed the land beneath the tires belonged to a single, coordinated metropolis. In reality, that continuous road network merely masks an intricate lattice of independent municipal jurisdictions, each operating under legal powers granted by 19th-century colonial land surveys. Significant questions remain unresolved today. Hydrologists at the Geological Survey of Canada and regional conservation authorities are still mapping the long-term depletion rates of deep, confined aquifers beneath the glacial moraines. It remains uncertain how many additional residential subdivisions can be supported before inland groundwater supplies face permanent collapse. At the same time, regional planners continue to debate whether provincial density mandates can overcome the deep-seated political resistance of individual municipal councils determined to protect their local commercial tax bases. Portions of the region's agricultural heritage and natural hydrological networks are being re-engineered every year, covered by industrial tilt-up warehouses and suburban asphalt before their ecological roles are fully documented. The official provincial map presents a clean, finished canvas of interconnected municipalities, unified transit corridors, and defined urban boundaries. But on the ground, beneath the highway overpasses and cul-de-sacs, the underlying terrain remains a volatile mosaic of competing jurisdictions, ancient glacial deposits, and uncoordinated development plans. The map looks finished, and the ground beneath it is not. Which boundary line, highway corridor, or planning anomaly in your own province or territory has always struck you as out of place on the map? Let us know in the comments below, and consider subscribing for more deep investigations into the hidden geography shaping North America.